we were very interested to know whether we'd get more men than women to this event, and it seems pretty even, which is rather encouraging. I'm going to be talking about research I did for 2 projects over the last few years. The first was all about sexual desire, how couples negotiate sex in their relationships. And the second was all about men. That led to the book, What Men Want. I had 150 men writing for me, answering surveys, writing diaries, talking about why sex meant so much to them. And when I started recruiting people for that project, I got this little letter from a man who said, I'm not sure that I'm going to qualify for this, because he explained he was a 71-year-old virgin. And he hadn't meant to be a 71-year-old virgin. He'd intended to get married and have kids and all of that. But he was waiting for the right woman to come along. And unfortunately, she never came. But he was a most interesting man because he had struggled all his life with his very strong sexual desire. And in fact, was on some sort of medication to help him deal with that. But he said, he had a lot of very good male friends, and he said talking to them made him realise that maybe he wasn't so badly off. At least I don't have any arguments in my household, he said. And he had quite a few married friends where he'd watched them spend their lives grovelling for sex or being sexually rejected. And he'd come to the conclusion that maybe his life hadn't been so bad in comparison to some of the frustrations of his mates. And I thought that was really interesting. And I mean, things like that's led me to the conclusion that life as a hot-blooded heterosexual married man isn't necessarily much fun these days. In my project, a lot of men talk to me about the whole business of working so hard trying to get that green light and living their lives negotiating, trying to keep her in the mood, trying to get her on heat, trying to see if they can actually enjoy some sexual favours from her, this sense of constantly be on the back foot. One man talked about having sex very doled out to him very reluctantly, like meaty bites to a dog. Now, we have a very real problem here, because we do have a real issue with women tending to go off sex when they settle into their relationships. There was a big survey done a few years ago, nearly 20,000 people surveyed. 55% of the women said they had low desire. And it means that men are stuck with this endless negotiation of trying to encourage their partner to be interested in sex, and the likelihood is she's going to be much less often interested than he is. There's a very nice story about this which involves 3 married men who are out on the golf course. And the first man says to the others, "Oh, you've no idea what I had to do to be allowed to come out and play golf today. I had to promise my wife I'd paint every room in the house." And the second man says, "Oh, that's nothing. I had to promise my wife I'd remodel the kitchen for her." And they continue playing, and they suddenly realise that the third guy hasn't said anything, and they turn to him and say, what, you haven't said anything. What did you do? What was the deal in your family? And the third man said, "Oh, it was easy. I set my alarm for 5:30, and when it went off, I turned off my alarm and gave my wife a nudge and said, 'Golf course or intercourse? Don't forget your jumper,' she said." There are huge numbers of stories about this whole business of mismatched desire. I noticed Steve Martin saying, "You know that look women get when they want sex? Me neither." So the experience of many men is the experience of being up against it, of trying to constantly have to negotiate with their partners for sex. Now, of course, not all women are in that situation of going off sex. I had, in my first project, which was published in the Sex Diaries, I had 1 in 10 women I called my juicy tomatoes. And they were women who had very strong drives and maintained those drives all their lives. They were just the most extraordinary women. Women who wanted sex 3 times a day and had felt like that for 30 years. I mean, it was just amazing, their level of energy and sexual energy, and many or else ordinary women who probably had a relatively normal libido, but with men who weren't interested, and they were very frustrated to find themselves in their situation. But there's no question that that it's the men who are more likely to have the eternal flame, the itch that never goes away. And I mean, it has to have something to do with the fact that men have up to 20 times the level of testosterone that women do. And it means their sexuality plays out very differently. I was just amazed reading some of the stories from the men. Their incredible frustration at always being the one to initiate sex. There was one man who said he was in that situation, his wife never initiated, and he finally said to his wife, "Okay, that's it, next time we have sex you're going to initiate." That was 8 years ago and they haven't had sex since. But one man wrote to me and said, "I could totally understand why Clinton would want to have oral sex in the Oval Office. I mean, he's got the weight of the world on his shoulders. Why wouldn't he use sex to try to escape from all that tension?" And when I talk to women about that, they say, "Are you crazy?" I mean, for most women, if we were really stressed out with the most, onerous job in the world, arguably, the last thing we'd want to use to get away from all the stresses and tensions was sex. I mean, women traditionally need to be relaxed in order to want sex. And yet a lot of the men said to me, "Oh yeah, I've had a really bad day at work. Sex is just what I need to get me away from all of that." And they told me all these stories of this sort of experience. It was so intriguing. Now, as I said, there are men who go off sex, and there are men who have very little sex drive all their lives, who'd far prefer to read a good book or read a really lousy book or have a good night's sleep than have sex. And there are men who start off with a strong drive and go off it for various reasons. But they're rare compared to the opposite problem, compared to the number of couples who are dealing with mismatched desire, where it's the man who's craving more sex than their partner. Now, it's different. This whole issue of going off sex is different for single women. And whenever I write about this, there's women who come in and say, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about. We all want lots of sex." And when you question them, and many of those are women who are single or women who don't have a steady relationship, this phenomenon I'm talking about of women going off sex tends to apply in domestic situations. I mean, there's a difference between sex in the wild and sex in captivity. I'm sure some of you will know Esther Perel's book called Mating in Captivity. Wonderful book, talking about the problems of how stress and everyday tensions and resentments and so on get in the way of women feeling like having sex. And many women find that in everyday life, they just go for years with no spontaneous desire. And that is how the whole problem develops. One of the fascinating things is we don't start off like that. There's really interesting research talking about the start of relationships, which finds that many women are really keen on sex when they first get together with their partner. "We were bonking like rabbits," one woman said to me. "I couldn't get enough of him." And yet within a few years that all starts to change. And there's fascinating research from a woman called Helen Fisher, you may know about, does really interesting work, and she's done research on that early phase of the relationships where couples are first in love. And she finds there's actually a different brain chemistry at that point. And I think that's about what happens there, is that creates a situation. You've got a new relationship, a new body, it's all very exciting, but you've also got something different happening in your brain, which means that women have a much stronger libido than they have when they settle into their relationships. And it causes all sorts of confusion. What's really interesting for me is we now have a situation where if women aren't interested in sex, it generally doesn't happen. And this is the most extraordinary thing, because this shift started to occur back in the 1960s and early 70s when I was first working in this area. This idea that if women don't have any sexual desire, they shouldn't have sex, that they have a right to say no. And of course that came from a really important place. We started learning then about marital rape and about sexual violence, and we understood that women simply had to have that right to say no to sex for civilised relations between men and women. But I don't think we expected women to say no for the next 20 years. I mean, it's been the most extraordinary shift to witness from a day back in the 1950s when women felt there were, sex was part of the sort of obligations of marriage. It was part of the give and take and negotiation that goes on to look to your partner's sexual needs as well as their other needs. And now there's been this enormous shift occurring to this assumption that if I'm not interested, I don't have to do this. It's interesting looking back to the 1960s because something else was going on there. Neil Armstrong, who, as I'm sure you know, was walking on the moon. And a very interesting story emerged because as he got back in the lunar module, he made a strange little comment. He said, "Good luck, Mr. Gorski." And the reporters kept asking him, who's this Gorski person? Is it a Soviet cosmonaut? I mean, no one could get an answer out of him. He refused to talk about it. And then after about 20 years, he said, some reporter asked him, and he said, "I can talk about that now." And he explained that when he was growing up in a little country town, the Gorskis were his next-door neighbours, and he was playing baseball with his mate one day, and the ball went over the fence. And he went to pick up the ball, and he was outside the Gorski bedroom window, and he heard Mrs. Gorski yell at Mr. Gorski, "Sex! You want sex? You'll get sex when the kid next door walks on the moon." I was so excited. I thought that's such a great story. It's an urban myth, unfortunately, and it constantly does the rounds of the internet. Sometimes they say oral sex, But, I mean, how fascinating, because the world is full of Mrs. Gorskis now. The world is full of women who feel absolutely entitled to shut up shop if they're not interested. And I find that the most extraordinary thing, particularly when you consider that, women do lots of things to look after their men, things that are quite difficult, They cook 3-course meals, they run around shopping centres looking for his favourite underpants, whatever. When a 10-minute bonk every now and then would make that man a lot happier than a lot of the things they kill themselves doing, keeping the perfect kitchen floor clean. I mean, how crazy is that? I always say when I talk about this that it's not as if you're asking someone to do something arduous or dangerous, is it? It's not like cleaning an oven. A doctor wrote to me the other day, a female doctor, saying she tells her patients it's not root canal therapy because I don't think you have to have intercourse. Of course, if it's not working for you, and you're making love and it doesn't start to happen, obviously you don't go ahead and have intercourse because I don't think that's a good idea, but a bottle of massage oil, 5 minutes, it's all over. It's not such a big deal. The important issue when it comes to this whole question of desire, which we've learnt only really recently, is that many women can enjoy sex without desire. A woman called Rosemary Basson, doing work with women who have had no interest in sex for years, finds that if you put the canoe in the water and start paddling, if you have your head in the right place, knowing that once you get started you will enjoy this, and you're with a man who knows how to make love to you, then many women find desire will kick in once they get going. And it's something that I've been exploring with lots of women for many years now, and it doesn't work for every woman, but it's a really important issue. The trouble is that women think it's all about sex. It's just about men getting their rocks off. Oh, for goodness sake, go round and round the Oval or have a cold shower. This idea that what's the big deal here? And yet, when you talk to men about what the deal is all about for them, you hear something very different from them. One of the fascinating things I could do when I was doing my first project, the Sex Diaries, and having these diaries pouring in every day, I can't tell you what fun that was. I'd leap out of bed every morning and to see what happened last night, one of the things I could do was get together ideas that were pouring in every day and trying them out on another group. And so women were talking to me about the fact that they hated being groped. They liked having his arms around them, they liked to cuddle, but inevitably the hand would then start on, going to the breast or the bottom, and it would turn into a grope. And I hate being groped, they said. Every time we spoon, I get forked, one woman said. So this was an interesting issue for me. So I got all these quotes about the grope and I sent them to a group of my men and I said, "Why do you do it if she says she hates it?" And one man wrote back and said, Look, I know I'm going to get into trouble. I know she doesn't like it, but it's me saying, hello, here I am. I still love you. I still want you. Where has she gone, the lover I married? I mean, I just found that heartbreaking. And I had so many men writing this passionate stuff about what sex meant to them. And it wasn't about getting their rocks off. They all knew they could masturbate. That wasn't it at all. It was about living in an intimate relationship or being married and expecting sex to be part of that, wanting that physical intimacy, wanting to feel wanted. They don't want to live with their roommates. They don't want to live with their sisters. They want a lover. And without that, the relationship is very different. So it's an amazing situation we have now, because if we ask men and women what's missing from their marriages, you get this huge list of complaints from women about the whole issue of what's going wrong in their lives and what's missing for them, you know, housework, emotional intimacy and so on. And if you ask men what's missing for them, they would say sex. We want more sex, and yet it's never talked about. And if you start to talk about it, you get attacked. There's a blog, Bettina Arndt, rape cheerleader. People so angry with me for saying this matters to men. I think men are doing a remarkable job keeping a lid on their sexual desires, and they never get any credit for it. It's the most extraordinary thing. All we ever hear about when we hear about men and sex is men in trouble. Men in trouble for not keeping their trousers zipped, men in trouble for groping or harassing women or for looking at pornography. Whatever it is, it's about things men are doing wrong. And we never hear about men's restraint. I think men are doing a remarkable job keeping a lid on their sexual desires, and we never hear about that. Look at the issue of affairs. I mean, the figures show, we had a really good survey done on this issue, which showed that 5% of married men have had an affair in the last year. I mean, that's nothing. Okay, over a long marriage that will add up. You know, he might have had an overnight affair, you know, 3 weeks at some point, even an affair lasting a year. But in a 29 or 30-year marriage, that's nothing. He's succeeding at monogamy most of the time and gets no credit from that. And I think that's the amazing situation we live in, that men are coping very well in a very frustrating situation. And using things that women really object to, like pornography, in order to satisfy their intense curiosity about sex and to cope with their frustrations. And yet all they hear about are what they're doing wrong and the fact that they're always under attack. So what I'm arguing is that sex is a really important thing for men. And it's one of the great joys of life, is what I hear from men. And it's about time we gave them the opportunity to celebrate this wonderful part of their lives instead of constantly attacking them. Thank you.
Thank you, Bettina. That was really interesting. We're going to open up to questions now. So hands up high. We'd love to hear from you.
How commonly do you think that men see prostitutes as a way to deal with a sexless marriage? And do you think this is a good thing or a bad thing for a marriage?
And it's interesting, I talked to a lot of my men about that sort of issue. And, I mean, there were men seeing prostitutes, there were men paying for sex or paying for a massage, erotic massage or whatever. Most of them doing so pretty reluctantly. A lot of men thinking about doing that and not doing it. And I've had over the years, and particularly the last year, quite a few emails from women who are prostitutes, a 60-year-old sex worker, for instance, talking about the number of men who come to her. Wives keep me in business, she said. And men who just want to be cuddled, men who just want to be able to talk to a woman about sex. I think it is part of the solution for some men, but I was intrigued at how reluctant many are to use that. But there are men who see themselves as having no other option.
Bettina, I don't know if you've got figures about this, but with the divorce rate having escalated to the point it is today, is a lack of sex in the marriage often the driving factor in those split-ups of marriages?
I'd say no, really, because what absolutely bowls me over is how many men stay in marriages. Most of the divorces are being instigated, separations are instigated by women. It's the women who leave, and the men tend to stick around. I mean, I had men who'd gone for 20 years with no sex in their marriages. A woman who'd had her second child and said, "That's it, I'm not interested." And the man sent me these love letters that he'd written to her, passionate letters saying how he just wanted to look at her, how gorgeous he thought she was, how he couldn't bear lying next to her night after night and not being able to touch her. And he eventually left the marriage, and she just couldn't believe it, because it was actually quite a good marriage in most ways. And the fact he left for sex, she couldn't understand. And he said, it was only in his early 50s, and he said, "I can't bear the idea of going through the rest of my life without a woman's arms around me." And yet, most men stay. I mean, it's just amazing to me. I have a website where I have a forum where people discuss a lot of this stuff, and there's a letter called "Should I Go or Should I Stay?" And it's had hundreds and hundreds of responses from people discussing this, and lots of men saying, because he has young children, weighing up the cost. I mean, men know about the cost of ending their marriages and the risk that they will lose their children, and certainly lose a house and a lot of money, and I think a lot of men are absolutely emotionally dependent on their relationships, and they're willing to pay the price of going through their lives with, very little sex. But it's an extraordinary price to pay, I think.
Amongst your correspondence, was there an incidence of the diary writing being therapeutic?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was amazed by that, because I hadn't anticipated that. But, I mean, because it was all a bit of an experiment. I just started this off and thought, well, let's see where this goes. And, the people who when they started writing, they were often so angry with each other. Amazing. One man saying, "I've got my own Gulf War here, because the 6 inches between us in the bed feels like 1,000 miles with this no-go zone between us." And men and women just furious with each other about this. And yet once they both started to write, inevitably they started to talk to each other. And they would, you could see things start to change. And I was also feeding in information, saying, "Do you feel maybe you could have done this differently, or maybe you should have done that?" And it was extraordinary how powerful that was. I now advise a lot of people in this sort of situation to write things down, to write a letter to her or to him. It works both ways. Of course, there are men rejecting their partners too. And here too I say, just do it. Men who've had prostate cancer treatment or are on hormone for prostate cancer treatment, which has wiped out their libido, they still have an obligation to see whether their partner is missing that physical intimacy. And they don't need an erection to make love to her. So I've always regarded this as a two-way street, the business of looking after each other's sexual needs. And yet, of course, it's always presented as me telling women to do something to men. But yeah, I think the whole business, the therapeutic aspect of this whole process was something that came as a surprise to me. But it was wonderful to be part of that. And I had so many people say it really helped them.
Hi, Bettina. You say that people interpret you as saying that it should just be women doing these things to men, but perhaps that's because you write a lot of articles suggesting that women do these things for men. I don't actually see a lot of, perhaps it's in your books and I accept that, but I don't actually see a lot of articles written explaining to men what they could maybe do to encourage intimacy from their wives. It always seems to be on the women. Do you not think that obligation is the enemy of desire?
No, because I think desire is a decision. And that's the problem. If you wait for desire to descend on you, it never does for lots of women. But women have very different attitudes around that, because some women don't see it as an onerous obligation. They say, "Oh, I don't like meatballs very much, but I cook meatballs for him because he likes them, and it's not a big deal, he does it." They don't see sex as something totally different from all the other areas where there are give and take in their marriage. And yet other people see it as a special category. I write a lot about what men should do for women. If I give an interview to a journalist and talk at length about, for instance, the men with prostate cancer and the fact that some of them are rejecting their partners, it never gets in. You know, the journalists always like to report me as, you know, this conservative old stick telling women to put out for their partners. My book is full of stories from women about their experiences. Stories from women are talking about the fact that their men need to make love to them better. They need to light their fire starting at breakfast and do things to turn them on. That they can't suddenly turn on, you know, 10 o'clock at night because he's interested. All that is in there. My women are absolutely magnificent, my diarists, and you know, they were always out there. But of course I focus on this because it is a ratio of 1 to 10 in my view of women rejecting men and only 10% the other way around. And that's the issue I wanted to focus on because I don't think that gets nearly enough attention. And the fact that I talk about that and get howled down suggests that there's a real issue here. I have had hundreds of letters from men saying, I have never heard anyone talk about this before. So why is that? Why are men being silenced on this issue?
I was just wondering, how much do you think the issue is a lack of sex in general versus a lack of sex with the man's partner specifically? Like if, and I'm, you know, not necessarily advocating this, but if, for example, a man knew that his partner was okay with him going and having sex with other women every now and then, and she was cool with that, what would that be like for the men?
Oh, there were plenty of people who, I mean, I think that was probably a much more common arrangement in times gone by, where women turned a blind eye. And it was an arrangement, and of course there's still cultures where that happens, where it's assumed that that's quite a good civilised concept, you know, if a man is interested in men. One of the things I didn't get to talk about is I think men have an intense sexual curiosity. And you know, if you like, I mean, the psychologists have always talked about that. The idea that men have an interest in sexual variety that's different from the way many women feel. And that is something that, you know, it means that they're going to be more likely to be interested in having more than one partner. And certainly if you look at the experiences of people going into swinging, it's usually the man who's pushing for a threesome or to get involved in swinging. And yet many women find they really, you know, the women who get involved with that sometimes find that they really enjoy it too. So I had couples writing for me who were into swinging or had that sort of arrangement you were talking about where she chose to turn the other way. She chose to assume that he would be faithful to her in all the ways that mattered, i.e. emotionally. I once had this wonderful experience I was talking about this whole issue on a radio program, and I said I wanted to hear from women who'd survived an affair, where the marriage had survived an affair. And I had this fantastic letter from a woman who wrote back and said she was dropping her husband, long marriage, very good marriage, dropping her husband's coat to the dry cleaner, and she, you know, as you do, she emptied the pockets in the dry cleaner and she pulled out this note. And it was clearly a note saying this is the end of an affair. We can't, you know, the letter was in a woman's handwriting. We can't go on like this. I think we have to stop. Blah, blah. And she recognised the handwriting as being written by one of her friends. Anyway, she said she went through this sort of big agony about it. All her friends said, oh, get rid of him. You know, you can't live with a man who's had an affair. How terrible. And she agonised and decided not only not to keep going in the marriage, but not even to say anything to him. Because she said, you know, it was clear from the letter they were stopping this relationship. And she went on and had a long, you know, many more years with her husband, and then he died. And she was at the funeral, and she maintained her relationship with the other woman. And she was she went and sat next to her at the funeral and pulled out the note and handed it to her. And said, I believe this belongs to you. And they're still friends. I mean, unusual, of course, but I've known lots of women who say, you know, I understand that, I know that to him, our relationship is the most important thing, and it suits me to have him satisfy some of his needs elsewhere. But that's something we rarely talk about now.
the British royal family seem to be dedicated to keeping that blind eye custom alive. But Bettina, could I first of all thank you not just for the topic you address, but the way you write about it. It's always a joy to read your column because of your writing style, which I really appreciate very much.
Thank you.
The question is, quite apart from men who might be bisexual or homosexual and go into marriage for whatever reason, does this syndrome of the loveless marriage in a sense force men into a reluctant homosexual relationship at all, or does that not happen?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's interesting that because there is this. I mean, I don't think it turns men gay, at all. I don't believe in that. But I think most of us have some capacity to be bisexual, which comes out in certain circumstances. It's not that we've been converted, but I mean, if we're in a prison, men in a prison situation, we all know that men can find themselves having sexual experiences with men when they didn't really think this was part of their nature. I'm very interested in it, and I've never really had the opportunity before to talk to men who regard themselves as totally heterosexual and yet have sexual relations with other men. And then I got this email from this man who, in passing, mentioned something about M&M sex. He was using the internet for various experiences. And I stupidly said, I don't know what's that all about. Of course, this was male. Amazing stuff, because he said he reached a stage of his life where he really felt you have to sort of try everything. You're only on this earth for a short period, etc., etc. And he said, what would be the point of having an affair with a woman? I've done that. And he deliberately went out and through the internet recruited other men, married heterosexual men. And he puts his golf sticks in the back of the car and goes off as if he's having a game of golf, and he finds another man who's in that sort of situation, and they romp around on the living room floor. I mean, most extraordinary thing. And yet he regards himself totally heterosexual. He has no sexual fantasies about men. He just wanted to have the opportunity to try things he hadn't tried before, namely oral, anal, stuff like that. And I mean, just fascinating. But so I don't think it's got anything to do with homosexuality as such. It's got to do with experiences he hadn't had. But I was very intrigued by that.